On a Tuesday morning in October of 1987, a man named Dale Prescott stood in the equipment yard of Prescott Agricultural Services in Hardin County, Iowa, and watched his entire fall season dissolve into something he couldn't fix with money or reputation or the three brand new machines sitting idle behind him. The problem wasn't complicated, at least not on paper. A 1931 Stover CT4 stationary engine, bolted to a grain elevator at the Holloway Farm 6 miles east of Eldora, had seized. Not stalled, not flooded. Seized, the kind of deep mechanical failure where the internal components lock together so completely that the engine becomes, in the language of the trade, a paperweight with cast iron ambitions. The Holloways had been running that elevator since 1953, and the Stover had been running since before that. And now it wasn't running at all, and the corn was coming in, and the corn needed to move, and Dale Prescott had promised Earl Holloway it would move. Let me tell you about Dale Prescott, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what happened to him. Dale was 44 years old in the fall of 1987, and he had built Prescott Agricultural Services from a single-bay repair shop into the largest farm equipment service operation in Hardin County. He had a fleet of service trucks, 3 full-time mechanics, a parts inventory that filled a warehouse the size of a basketball court, and a reputation he had spent 20 years constructing brick by brick. He was the kind of man who arrived early and stayed late and believed, with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been seriously wrong about machinery, that any mechanical problem could be solved with sufficient expertise and sufficient equipment. He wore clean Carhartt work clothes and drove a late-model pickup and spoke in the clipped, confident cadences of a man who had learned that hesitation costs money. He had never met a machine he couldn't fix, or so he had told himself, and so he had told Earl Holloway, and so he had told his own mechanics when they looked at the Stover and shook their heads. The first attempt had been straightforward. Dale's lead mechanic, a man named Greg Sutherland, who had been working engines for 15 years, spent 2 days trying to free the seized piston with penetrating oil and a breaker bar. He used 3 cans of liquid wrench, 2 cans of PB Blaster, a half-gallon of transmission fluid mixed with acetone, and enough heat from a propane torch to make the cast iron tick and groan. The piston did not move, not a fraction of an inch. Greg told Dale the bore was probably scored, that the rings had fused to the cylinder wall, that the engine had likely sat in a wet barn for long enough that rust had done what rust does when it has years in iron and nobody watching. Dale told Greg to keep trying. The second attempt came 4 days later, after Dale had driven to Des Moines and rented a hydraulic press attachment designed for exactly this kind of work. It was a piece of equipment that cost him $340 to rent for 3 days, and that Greg and another mechanic named Todd Briggs spent the better part of a morning rigging to the Stover's exposed cylinder. They applied 8,000 pounds of hydraulic pressure to the piston crown. The Stover absorbed it without comment. The piston did not move. Greg looked at Dale and said nothing, which was the most honest thing he could have said. The third attempt was the one that worried Dale most, not because it failed, but because of how it failed. He had called a machinist in Ames, a man who specialized in antique engine restoration, and paid him $600 to drive out to the Holloway farm and assess the situation. The machinist, whose name was Keith Vandermeer, and who had been working on engines since 1961, spent 45 minutes examining the Stover. He tapped the cylinder walls with a small hammer and listened to the sound it made. He looked down the bore with a flashlight. He tried to rotate the crankshaft by hand. Then he stood up, wiped his hands on a red shop rag, and told Dale that in his professional opinion, the engine was past saving. The cylinder bore was scored beyond repair, the piston rings had corroded into the cylinder wall in at least 3 places, and the crankshaft showed signs of barren failure that would require a complete disassembly and rebuild that would cost more than the engine was worth, assuming the parts could even be sourced for a 1931 Stover CT4, which he doubted. He recommended Dale tell Earl Holloway to find a different elevator arrangement for the season and consider the Stover a loss. Dale paid Keith Vandermeer his $600 and drove back to Eldora and sat in his office for a long time. The corn was still coming in. Earl Holloway had 400 acres of corn that needed to move through that elevator, and the nearest alternative was 12 miles away and already running at capacity, and the season was not going to wait for Dale Prescott to find a solution that a professional machinist had just told him didn't exist. Let me tell you about Emmett Borgman, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Emmett was 71 years old in the fall of 1987, and he had farmed 320 acres in the bottomland east of Eldora for going on 48 years. He had bought the land in 1939 with money borrowed from his father and a federal land bank loan at 4% interest, and he had paid it off in 11 years, and he had never borrowed against it since. His father had farmed before him, and his grandfather had broken the original sod on that ground in 1891, and Emmett had grown up understanding that the land was not something you owned so much as something you were responsible for, a distinction that sounds philosophical until you understand that it governed every decision he made for 5 decades. Emmett was a watcher. That was the word his wife Lorraine used when she described him to people who didn't know him. Not a complainer, not a talker, not a man who offered opinions unless asked, but a watcher, the kind of man who stood at the edge of things and observed with a patience that most people mistook for slowness. He had watched Dale Prescott's service trucks come and go from the Holloway farm over the previous 2 weeks. He had watched Greg Sutherland carry in the hydraulic press. He had watched Keith Vandermeer arrive in his clean sedan and leave again. He had watched all of this from the cab of his tractor while he finished his own harvest, and he had formed an opinion that he kept to himself until the evening of the day Keith Vandermeer left. That evening, Emmett drove his 1952 Ford pickup down the county road to Earl Holloway's farm and knocked on the door and asked Earl if he might take a look at the Stover. Earl said yes, mostly because he had run out of better options. Emmett spent an hour with the engine, doing things that looked to Earl's eye like nothing in particular. He brought a small pen light and looked down the bore from both ends. He brought a machinist's stethoscope, a simple device, a length of metal rod with a handle, that cost about $4 at any hardware store, and pressed it against the cylinder walls in different places and listened. He tried to rotate the crankshaft not with force, but with a gentle rocking motion, back and forth, an inch at a time, feeling for where the resistance concentrated. He looked at the water jacket and the oil passages. He sat on an overturned bucket for a while and looked at the engine without touching it. Then he went home. The next morning, he called Dale Prescott. Dale did not know Emmett Borgman well. He knew the name, knew the farm, knew that Emmett was one of the older operators in the county who still ran some equipment that Dale's mechanics considered museum pieces. Dale answered the phone with the particular wariness of a man who has recently been told his problem has no solution and is not eager to hear more opinions about it. Emmett said he had looked at the Stover. Dale said he appreciated that. Emmett said he thought he could free it. Dale said the machinist from Ames had told him the bore was scored beyond repair. Emmett said he had heard that, and that he wasn't talking about the bore yet. He was talking about freeing the piston, and that those were two different problems, and that Dale's men had been treating them as the same problem, which was why they hadn't made any progress. Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what Emmett had in mind. Emmett said he had a hot tank. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Do you know what a hot tank is? Not in the abstract, not the general idea, but what it actually is and what it actually does, and why a man who spent his life working on engines would reach for one in a situation where hydraulic presses and penetrating oil had failed. Because the answer to that question is the answer to this entire story, and it requires a moment to explain properly. A hot tank is, at its simplest, a large steel vat filled with a caustic solution, typically a mixture of sodium hydroxide and water, sometimes with other cleaning agents added, that is heated to between 180 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit and maintained at that temperature for hours or days. The solution is not a solvent in the way that penetrating oil is a solvent. It does not try to break the bond between corroded surfaces by seeping between them and dissolving the rust. It does something more fundamental. It attacks organic material, grease, paint, gasket material, carbon deposits, varnish, and strips it away completely, leaving bare metal. And it does something else. Something that is easy to underestimate until you have seen it work. It heats the entire assembly uniformly and holds it at temperature for long enough that the different metals in the engine, cast iron, steel, bronze, expand at their different rates and then contract, and in that expansion and contraction, surfaces that have been locked together for years by rust and corrosion sometimes, not always but sometimes, release their grip. The key word is uniformly. Dale Prescott's mechanics had applied heat with a propane torch, which heats a small area very quickly and creates thermal gradients, hot spots and cold spots, that can actually increase the binding force between seized components by expanding one surface faster than the adjacent surface. A hot tank heats everything at once and holds it there. It is slow, it is patient, it is the opposite of a hydraulic press. Emmett Borgman had built his hot tank in 1954 from a 200-gallon stock tank and a pair of propane burners salvaged from an old commercial laundry. He had used it for 33 years to clean engine blocks, free seized components, and strip paint from parts that needed replating. It was, by any modern standard, a primitive piece of equipment. It was also exactly the right tool for this particular problem, and Emmett had known that from the moment he pressed his machinist's stethoscope against the stover's cylinder wall and heard what it told him. What it told him was that the seizure was not uniform. There were 2 points of primary contact. 2 places where the piston rings had corroded most severely into the cylinder wall, and the rest of the bore, while dirty and varnished, was not scored in the way Keith Vandermeer had assumed. Vandermeer had looked at the engine and seen a seized piston and made a diagnosis based on what seized pistons usually mean. Emmett had looked at the engine and listened to it and heard something more specific. He called Dale back the next morning and said he would need the engine brought to his shop. Dale hesitated. The stover was bolted to a wooden platform that was bolted to the floor of the elevator building, and it weighed somewhere around 400 pounds without the platform, and moving it would take time and equipment and would mean tearing out the drive belt arrangement that connected it to the elevator mechanism. Dale pointed all of this out. Emmett said he understood that, and that the alternative was leaving it where it was and not fixing it, and that the choice was Dale's to make. Dale said he would send Greg Sutherland over with a truck and a come-along. Greg Sutherland arrived at Emmett's farm the following afternoon with the stover in the bed of a service truck, wrapped in moving blankets, looking like something being transported to a funeral. Emmett came out of his shop to meet him, wearing a canvas jacket over a flannel shirt and a seed cap that had been washed so many times the original green had faded to something closer to gray. He was not a large man. He was lean and deliberate in his movements, the kind of man whose hands did exactly what they intended to do, and nothing extra. Greg helped him carry the stover into the shop and set it on a wooden workbench. Greg looked at the hot tank, which was sitting in the corner of the shop, looking like exactly what it was. A battered steel vat with propane burners underneath and a patina of chemical residue on its sides that suggested decades of use. Greg looked at it the way a man looks at something he is trying to be polite about. He said he hoped Emmett knew what he was doing. Emmett said he appreciated that. Greg drove back to Eldora. Emmett mixed his solution: sodium hydroxide, water, a small amount of a commercial degreaser he had been buying from the same farm supply store since 1961, and lit the burners and let the tank come up to temperature. While it heated, he spent 2 hours doing something that no one from Dale Prescott's operation had done. He disassembled everything he could disassemble without freeing the piston. He removed the head, he removed the valves, he removed the carburetor and the magneto and every external component that could be taken off without disturbing the stuck assembly. He was not trying to free the piston yet. He was trying to understand the engine, and the way Emmett Borgman understood engines was by taking them apart and looking at what was inside. What he found confirmed what his stethoscope had suggested. The bore was dirty and varnished and stained with rust, but it was not scored in the catastrophic sense that Vandermeer had described. There were 2 bands of heavy corrosion at the top ringland and the second ringland where the rings had been sitting stationary long enough for rust to build up and lock them in place. Below those 2 bands, the bore was rough but intact. The piston itself was aluminum. The stover, CT4, had used an aluminum piston in a cast iron bore, which was unusual for 1931 and which Emmett had known before he ever looked at the engine, because he had owned a Stover CT2 since 1949 and knew the design. The aluminum had not corroded in the way cast iron corrodes. It had oxidized on the surface, but it had not fused to the bore. The rings were the problem. The rings were iron, and the bore was iron, and they had been sitting in contact with moisture for long enough that they had become, in the places where the corrosion was heaviest, effectively one piece. Emmett lowered the engine block into the hot tank at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He turned off the lights in the shop and went inside for supper. Lorraine asked him how it was going. He said it was going fine. She put a plate of pork chops and boiled potatoes in front of him, and he ate without saying much else, which was how he ate most evenings, and which Lorraine had long since stopped interpreting as any kind of commentary on the food or the company. He went back to the shop at 9 o'clock and checked the temperature and adjusted the burners and went to bed. He checked it again at 6 in the morning. The solution was doing what it was supposed to do. He could see the accumulated grime of 56 years lifting off the cast iron in slow dark clouds, drifting to the bottom of the tank. He left it alone. At 2 in the afternoon of the second day, he pulled the block out of the tank with a pair of steel hooks and set it on a wooden pallet and let it drain. The cast iron was clean in a way that cast iron almost never is. Bare and gray and slightly rough to the touch, the way new castings look before they accumulate the history of use. He let it cool to a temperature he could work with, which took about an hour, and then he set it in a vise on his workbench and picked up a tool that he had made himself in 1962 from a length of steel rod and a hardwood handle. It was a piston knocker, not a commercial tool. There was no commercial tool that would have fit this particular bore, but a shop-made implement designed to deliver a controlled impact to the piston crown from the bottom of the bore, using the mechanical advantage of a long handle to concentrate force at a precise point. Emmett had made it for a seized Fairbanks Morse engine in 1962, and had used it perhaps a dozen times since on various antique engines that came to him in similar condition. He applied a small amount of penetrating oil to the ringlands, not to the piston crown, where Dale's mechanics had been applying it, but to the ring grooves themselves, where the corrosion was actually occurring, and let it sit for 30 minutes. Then he positioned the knocker against the piston crown from below and struck the handle with a 2-pound hammer. Not hard. Not with the force of a man trying to break something loose, with the force of a man delivering information to a piece of metal and waiting to hear what it said back. The piston moved. Not much. A fraction of a millimeter, perhaps less, but it moved, and Emmett felt it move through the handle of the knocker, and he set the hammer down and picked up his machinist's stethoscope and listened to the ring lands again, and what he heard told him the top ring had released at the primary corrosion point and was now only held by the secondary point at the second ring land. He applied more penetrating oil to the second ring groove and waited another 30 minutes. Then he struck the knocker again, slightly harder, and the piston moved a full millimeter, and then another tap, and it moved 3 millimeters, and then he could see it moving from the top of the bore, a faint silver circle appearing where the aluminum crown was rising toward the opening, and he set the knocker down and picked up a wooden mallet and tapped the piston crown from the top, gently, rocking it slightly side to side to work the second ring free, and with a sound that Emmett later described to Lorraine as something between a sigh and a pop, the piston came free and slid out of the bore and into his waiting hand. He set it on the workbench and looked at it for a moment. Then he went inside and called Dale Prescott. Dale arrived at Emmett's farm the following morning with Greg Sutherland and, somewhat to Emmett's surprise, with Earl Holloway, who had apparently insisted on coming when Dale told him what had happened. They stood in the shop, and Dale picked up the piston and turned it over in his hands and looked at the ring grooves and looked at the bore and looked at Emmett. He said, "How?" It was not quite a question. It was the sound a man makes when his understanding of a situation has been revised so completely that the revision hasn't finished processing yet. Emmett told him about the hot tank and the thermal cycling and the ring lands. He explained the difference between scoring and corrosion, and why the two required different approaches, and why applying force to a seized piston before addressing the corrosion at the ring grooves was like trying to open a locked door by pushing harder on it instead of finding the key. He said it plainly and without drama, the way he said most things, looking at Dale and Greg and Earl in turn to make sure they were following. Greg Sutherland was nodding slowly. He was a good mechanic and he understood what he was being told, and the expression on his face was the particular expression of a man who has just learned something he wishes he had known 3 weeks ago. Dale was quiet for longer than Greg. Then he asked what Emmett wanted for his time. Emmett said he didn't want anything for his time. He said the Holloways had been his neighbors for 30 years, and the corn needed to move, and that was reason enough. Dale said that wasn't acceptable, that he had a business to run and he paid for services rendered, and he named a figure. Emmett said he appreciated that, but that if Dale wanted to do something with the money, the Eldora Methodist Church was putting a new roof on the fellowship hall and could use the contribution. Dale said he would write the check that afternoon. They carried the stover back to the Holloway farm that same day, and Emmett spent the afternoon reassembling it, honing the bore with a flex hone he had been using since 1967. Fitting new rings that he had sourced from an antique engine parts dealer in Ohio, whose catalog he had been ordering from since 1974, and reinstalling the valves and head and carburetor and magneto. He adjusted the timing by ear, the way he had learned to do it from his father, turning the magneto in small increments and listening to the engine's response with the patience of a man who has nowhere else to be. At 5:30 in the afternoon, he pulled the starting rope. The stover fired on the third pull. It ran rough for about 2 minutes while it cleared the last of the varnish from the carburetor passages, and then it smoothed out into the particular sound that a well-tuned sideshaft engine makes, a slow, authoritative chuff, chuff, chuff that you feel in your chest as much as you hear with your ears. And the drive belt began to turn, and the elevator began to move grain, and Earl Holloway stood in the doorway of the elevator building with his arms at his sides and said nothing for a long time. Dale Prescott stood next to him and also said nothing. Greg Sutherland was looking at the engine with the expression of a man making a list of things he intended to learn. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end with the stover running. Dale Prescott drove back to Eldora and wrote a check to the Eldora Methodist Church for $400, which was more than he had offered Emmett and which he did not mention to Emmett or to anyone else for several years. He also went home that evening and sat at his kitchen table and did something he had not done since he was a young mechanic just starting out. He wrote down what he had learned that day. Not in a formal way, not in a business log, but in the small spiral notebook he kept in his shirt pocket for parts numbers and measurements and phone numbers. He wrote down the difference between scoring and corrosion. He wrote down the principle of thermal cycling and what a hot tank does that a torch cannot do. He wrote down the phrase ring lands and underlined it. He had been in the equipment business for 20 years and had never thought carefully about ringlands, and the fact that Emmett Borgman had known something about them that he and his mechanics and a professional machinist from Ames had not known was the kind of fact that a certain type of man finds intolerable and another type of man finds educational. Dale Prescott was, it turned out, the second type, which is not something everyone would have predicted about him before that October. Over the following months, Dale asked Greg Sutherland to look into antique engine restoration, not as a business line. Prescott Agricultural Services was a modern operation, and Dale had no intention of turning it into a museum. But as a body of knowledge that he had discovered, somewhat embarrassingly, he was missing. Greg spent the winter reading. He found the same parts dealer in Ohio that Emmett used. He found a network of antique engine collectors and restorers who communicated through newsletters and swap meets, and who possessed, collectively, a depth of mechanical knowledge about pre-war and early post-war engines that no amount of modern training had prepared Dale's operation to access. Greg reported back to Dale in the spring with a list of tools and references and contacts, and Dale authorized him to acquire them. The hot tank that Dale eventually installed in the Prescott Agricultural Services shop was a commercial unit, stainless steel, thermostatically controlled, purchased new from an industrial supplier for $2,200. It was considerably more sophisticated than Emmett's stock tank and propane burners. It worked on exactly the same principle. Emmett Borgman heard about this second-hand through Earl Holloway, who had heard it from Greg Sutherland. He did not comment on it. He did not need to. Let me tell you about Emmett in the years that followed, because the story of a man is not complete in a single afternoon. He farmed his 320 acres through the late 1980s, and into the 1990s, reducing his row crop acreage gradually as his knees made the long hours in the tractor cab less comfortable than they had been. He kept his shop running. Word had gotten around, the way word gets around in a county of a few hundred farms where everyone knows everyone's equipment and everyone knows everyone's business, that Emmett Borgman was the man to call when you had an old engine that nobody else could fix. He did not advertise this. He did not charge for it in any consistent way. He accepted what people offered and declined what he thought was too much, and occasionally accepted nothing at all when the person asking couldn't afford to offer anything. He had a 1929 Fairbanks Morse Z that he had rebuilt 3 times since 1955. He had a 1917 IHC Famous that had belonged to his grandfather and that he kept running, not because it was useful but because it was his grandfather's, and that seemed reason enough. He had the Stover CT2 he had owned since 1949, which he used to run a small feed grinder, and which he maintained with the same unhurried attention he gave everything else. His shop was full of the kind of things that people who don't understand them call junk. Flywheels and connecting rods and crankshafts and magnetos and carburetor rebuilding kits for engines that hadn't been manufactured in 60 years, and that people who do understand them call a library. He died in March of 1999, at the age of 82, of a heart attack that came quietly in the night without warning or drama, which was consistent with how he had lived. The funeral was at the Eldora Methodist Church, in the fellowship hall with the new roof. Dale Prescott was there. Greg Sutherland was there. Earl Holloway was there. Most of the farmers in the eastern part of Hardin County were there, and a number of people from outside the county who had heard about Emmett through the antique engine networks and the swap meets and the word of mouth that travels through communities of people who care about old machines. His son, a man named Gerald Borgman, who had grown up in that shop and who had been watching his father work on engines since before he could reach the workbench, inherited the farm and the shop and the collection. Gerald was 51 years old when his father died and had been farming his own ground nearby for 25 years. He was not the watcher his father had been. He was more talkative, more willing to offer an opinion without being asked. But he had his father's hands and his father's patience with machinery, and he knew where every tool in the shop belonged and why it was there. The hot tank was still there. The Stover CT2 was still there. The 1917 IHC Famous was still there. The Fairbanks Morse Z was still there. Gerald maintained them the way his father had, not as a museum but as a working collection. Engines that ran, tools that were used, knowledge that was kept alive through practice rather than preservation. Let me tell you about what happened in the spring of 2004, because the story doesn't end with a funeral. A man named Tyler Crowley had taken over the management of Prescott Agricultural Services after Dale Prescott semi-retired in 2001. Tyler was 38 years old and had a degree in agricultural mechanics from Iowa State and 10 years of experience with modern farm equipment and a confidence in his own expertise that reminded several of the older mechanics in the shop of someone they couldn't quite place at first and then could. He ran a good operation. He was knowledgeable about current equipment, efficient with his time, and genuinely skilled at the kind of diagnostics that modern computerized farm machinery required. In the spring of 2004, a farmer named Howard Dykstra brought in a 1938 VT engine that had been running a water pump on his property since his father's time. The Vita had seized over the winter. Tyler looked at it and told Howard it was past saving. The bore was gone, the parts were unobtainable, The cost of restoration would exceed the value of the engine by a factor of 3. He recommended Howard replace the pump drive with a modern electric motor. Howard Dykstra was 67 years old and had known Emmett Borgman for 40 years. He drove out to Gerald Borgman's farm that afternoon. Gerald came out of the shop to meet him, wiping his hands on a red shop rag. Howard told him about the Vita. Gerald asked a few questions. Where had it been stored? How long had it been seized? Had anyone tried to force it? Then he said he would take a look. He loaded the Vita into his truck and brought it to the shop and mixed his solution and lit the burners under the hot tank. While it came up to temperature, he disassembled everything he could disassemble without disturbing the stuck assembly. He removed the head and the valves and the carburetor. He pressed his father's machinist's stethoscope, the same one, the simple steel rod with the wooden handle, the $4 tool, against the cylinder walls and listened. He lowered the Vit into the hot tank at 4 in the afternoon. He checked it at 9 that night and again at 6 in the morning. On the afternoon of the second day, he pulled it out and let it drain and cool and went to work with the shop-made piston knocker that his father had built in 1962. The Vita's piston came free on the third tap. Gerald called Howard Dykstra and told him to come pick up his engine. Howard asked what he owed. Gerald said what his father would have said, that Howard had been a neighbor for a long time and that was reason enough, but that if he wanted to do something with the money, the Fellowship Hall roof was going to need attention again before too long. Tyler Crowley heard about this through Greg Sutherland, who was still working at Prescott Agricultural Services, and who told the story the way Greg told most stories, plainly, without editorializing, letting the facts carry whatever weight they carried. Tyler listened and did not say much. He had his father's notebook. Dale had given it to him when Tyler took over the shop, along with the service records and the parts inventory, and that evening he found the entry from October of 1987. The handwriting was his father's, small and precise. Ringlands, thermal cycling, hot tank principle, the difference between scoring and corrosion. He read it twice. The next morning, he drove out to Gerald Borgman's farm and knocked on the door. Gerald came to the door in his work clothes, a little surprised to see Tyler Crowley standing on his porch at 8 in the morning. Tyler said he had heard about the Vita. Gerald said he had figured that was why Tyler was there. Tyler said he wanted to understand what Gerald had done and why it had worked, and whether Gerald would be willing to explain it to him. Gerald looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Come on in." They spent most of the morning in the shop. Gerald showed Tyler the hot tank and explained the thermal cycling principle and the difference between scoring and corrosion and why the ringlands were the primary point of failure in a long-seized engine. He showed Tyler the piston knocker his father had made in 1962 and explained the mechanical logic of it, why a controlled impact from below was more effective than hydraulic pressure from above, because it worked with the direction the piston needed to travel rather than against the geometry of the seizure. He showed Tyler his father's machinist's stethoscope and explained what it told you if you knew how to listen. Tyler asked good questions. He had an engineering education, and he understood the principles quickly once they were explained in terms he could connect to things he already knew. Gerald answered the questions without impatience, the way his father had answered questions, which was to say that he treated each question as a reasonable thing for a person to ask rather than as evidence of ignorance. At one point, Tyler said, "My father wrote in his notebook that your father told him the locked door analogy, that you can't open a locked door by pushing harder on it." Gerald nodded. He said his father had used that analogy a lot. He said his father believed that most mechanical problems that looked like force problems were actually understanding problems, and that the difference between a machine you could fix and a machine you couldn't was usually a matter of whether you had taken the time to understand what was actually wrong before you started applying solutions. Tyler was quiet for a moment. Then he said that was the kind of thing that sounded obvious when you heard it, and wasn't obvious at all when you were standing in front of a seized engine with a hydraulic press and a deadline. Gerald said that was exactly right. He said that was why his father had always started by listening. They shook hands in the driveway, and Tyler drove back to Eldora, and Gerald went back into the shop. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story doesn't end there either, and because the last thing is the part that explains why any of this matters. In the summer of 2011, Gerald Borgman's youngest son, a young man named Caleb, who was 24 years old and had studied mechanical engineering at Iowa State and had come back to Hardin County not because he had to, but because he wanted to, was helping his father sort through a collection of old engine parts that had come from an estate sale in Grundy County. Among the parts was a set of cast iron components that Caleb initially couldn't identify. They were precisely machined, clearly old, clearly part of something significant, but none of the identifying marks matched anything in the standard reference catalogs. Caleb spent 2 evenings on the internet and in his father's library of antique engine manuals before he found what he was looking for. The components were from a 1909 Charter gas engine, one of the earliest commercially produced internal combustion engines manufactured in Illinois, and they were, as far as Caleb could determine from the serial number and the casting marks, from one of the first 200 units ever built. If the components were original and complete, the engine they belonged to would be one of perhaps a dozen known surviving examples of that model in running or restorable condition. He brought the parts to his father and spread them on the workbench and explained what he had found. Gerald looked at the parts for a long time. He picked up the cylinder casting and turned it over in his hands and looked at the bore and the ringlands and the water jacket. He set it down and picked up the crankshaft and checked the journals. He was quiet in the way his father had been quiet when he was thinking. Then Caleb said he thought they could restore it. He said he had found a machinist in Illinois who specialized in pre-1920 engines and who had sourced parts for charter restorations before. He said the bore was rough but not scored. He said the crankshaft journals were worn but within tolerances that could be addressed with bearing inserts. He said it would take time and money and patience, but that the result would be a running example of one of the earliest internal combustion engines ever built in America, and that there were collectors and museums who would be very interested in such a thing. Gerald listened to all of this without interrupting. When Caleb finished, Gerald looked at his son for a moment, and then looked at the parts on the workbench, and then looked at the hot tank in the corner of the shop, which had been there since 1954, and which still worked exactly as it had always worked. He said, "Let's start with the hot tank." Caleb smiled. They lit the burners that afternoon. The Charter gas engine took 14 months to restore. It required parts sourced from 3 states and a machinist in Rockford, Illinois, and a carburetor specialist in Ohio, and one component that Gerald fabricated himself on a metal lathe that had belonged to his father and his father's father before that. When it was finished, it ran, not smoothly at first. 14 months of work, and it still needed another 3 weeks of tuning and adjustment and patient listening before it ran the way it was supposed to run. But it ran, and the sound it made was the sound of 1909, a slow and deliberate mechanical heartbeat that had no equivalent in anything built after the First World War. Gerald donated it to the Hardin County Historical Society, where it sits today in a climate-controlled room with a placard that explains its provenance and its significance. The placard does not mention Emmett Borgman or the Stover CT-4 or Dale Prescott or the October of 1987. History doesn't always record the chain of custody that leads to preservation, but the people in Hardin County who know the story know that the charter gas engine is running today because Emmett Borgman listened to a seized Stover with a $4 stethoscope in 1987, and because Dale Prescott wrote down what he learned in a small spiral notebook, and because Gerald Borgman inherited his father's patience along with his father's tools, and because Caleb Borgman came home to a county where those things were still valued. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. The Stover CT2 is still in Gerald Borgman's shop. He runs it every spring to make sure it runs, the way his father did, and his father before that. The engineers and the machinists and the equipment dealers will tell you it's an antique, a curiosity, something that belongs in a museum or a scrapyard depending on your tolerance for sentiment. The Borgmans run it anyway. That's what happens when a man spends 50 years listening to what machines are trying to tell him, and teaches his son to listen, and his son teaches his son, and the knowledge moves forward not because anyone wrote a manual, but because someone always took the time to understand what was actually wrong before they started applying solutions. That's the difference between a machine that gets thrown away and a machine that outlasts everyone who ever said it was past saving. That's what happens when you stop pushing on the locked door and start looking for the key.